take a topic titled wine. Let me move this here. Wine for the allergist. So Catherine, go ahead.
Okay. Um, First of all, just remind everybody to mute their microphones, please. I'm told to do so. Yeah, as my father said, we were given the opportunity to pick our topic. And for those of you who were around when Gary Ayers still give journal club talks, you know, he often did a topic that was completely unrelated to allergy. So I thought I would follow in a similar suit and pick something that I think would still be interesting, but just a little bit off topic, maybe. We're gonna kind of get into a little bit of the medicine of it as well, though. So not entirely irrelevant, maybe, or at least not entirely unrelated to the field of medicine. I have no disclosures other than, frankly, just to say that I'm by no means an expert in wine. I'm not a master sommelier. I frankly just wanted to learn a little bit more about wine myself. Frankly, many of you online right now know more about wine than I do, but I just wanted to learn a little bit more myself. Here's an overview of what we're going to be talking about today. So initially, we'll just take a quick dive into the history of wine, starting back into ancient times and then coming a little bit more closely to current times. Then we'll go through some of the common varieties, both white wine, red wine, and then briefly just talking a little bit about some of the regional varieties, as well as some of the special wines. And then we'll talk about kind of this history of enotherapy, or meaning kind of the treatment with wine and how it came to be that we thought maybe wine could have some medicinal effects. And then we'll go into just some of the components or compounds that are in that make up wine, and what we think may be the ones that actually have potential health benefits or even potentially negative effects on the human body. And then lastly, we'll go into some of the studies that have actually been done to evaluate the health effects of wine, although in some cases it's actually just evaluating, frankly, just all forms of alcohol. And we'll primarily focus on cardiovascular disease, blood pressure, and cancer, but certainly numerous other conditions have been evaluated. And then when we get into cancer, we'll just speak a little more specifically about breast cancer, because that's one where there seems to be a little bit more definitive evidence, because as you'll see when we do get to this section, the data is still a little bit uncertain. And these are just kind of the objectives for the day. All right, so without further ado, so starting off with the history, so starting back far back in ancient times, so it's believed that the wine originated sometime around 6000 BC in the Caucasus Mountain region, which is now modern day Armenia and Georgia. And truthfully, actually, it may be earlier that the Chinese developed fermented drinks, maybe as early as 7000 BC. However, that was made from fermented rice or honey or other fruits. So if you're really considering to be a wine purist, meaning that it had to have been made from grapes themselves, then it's thought to have originated in the Caucasus Mountain regions around 6000 BC. Archaeologists have discovered that probably the first winery was made in 4000 BC in a cave in Armenia. And then wine and vines made their way down to Egypt shortly thereafter, who then began to kind of experiment with this concept of winemaking. Then throughout 1500 to 300 BC, the Phoenicians transported wine and wine grapes all throughout the Mediterranean region, allowing them to reach Greece. And then the Greeks became rapid growers and traders of grapes. And then the Greeks, of course, expanded into Italy. And then around 150 BC, the Greek Empire declined and the Romans took over, growing grapes and producing and then expanding into what is now modern day Europe and modern day France and Spain. In fact, the Romans published the first book about how to grow grapes and to make wine. And the Romans, and we'll get into this a little bit later, but the Romans encouraged their soldiers to drink wine to promote good health. So this is just a quick map that shows kind of that distribution pattern. So the black dot here being the Caucasus Mountain region, and then kind of the spread of wine grapes and viticulture throughout what is now modern day Europe. So then moving along, so in 500 AD, the Roman Empire fell. And then in 1000 AD, Chateau de Galon was built. This is the oldest operating winery today. It's located in France. In 1530, vineyards or wine vines reached the New World, and they were transported there by the Portuguese and the Spaniards. And then in 1659, grapevines were first introduced into South Africa. 1693, Dom Perignon invented champagne. And then in 1740 is actually the first time that the bottles for storing wine were redesigned to lie properly flat, allowing them to age in a better process. And then in 1780, that is the first time that California made wine, and it was actually produced by Franciscan monks. So this is not a commercial wine, but just the first wine that was ever made in California. And then in 1857, the first commercial winery was established in California, and that's the Buena Vista Winery. In 1870, phylloxera, which is an insect or a pest, destroyed over 75% of France's vineyards. Obviously, they've come back from that. And then the 1920s were obviously the Prohibition era in the United States. In 1960, the first box wine was first made. And then in 1976, that was the year that in a blind tasting test, a California wine beat out a French wine in the Paris wine tasting event. And that's kind of what put California wines on the map as actually being serious winemakers. And this was turned into a movie later called Bottle Shock in 2008. So now we'll segue just quickly into some of the different grape varieties. So again, talking about white wines, red wines, and then some of the regional varieties, and then special wines. There's thousands of different grape varieties. So these are really just some of the more common ones that you'll tend to come across. Just briefly though, wine grapes themselves are obviously different than the ones that we buy at the grocery store and eat as snacks. So they're of the species Vitis vinifera. They are much smaller and have much thicker skins than the ones that we tend to eat. And it's in the thick skins where a lot of the compounds are that we'll talk about when we get into the medical aspect of it. They also tend to be a little bit sweeter than your standard grape, and they have more seeds. So getting into white wines, so they obviously come from, or usually come from green grapes. A very simple overview of the process of making wine. Frankly, that could be a whole series of lectures in and of itself. People go to school for that, obviously. But a very simple overview of it is that you pick the grapes off the vineyard or off the vines, you squeeze the grapes down, and you collect the juice. And in the case of white wine, immediately the skins and stems are removed, so they don't gain any sort of color from that. And then you add yeast and sugar, which then allows the fermentation process to happen. And that's when then alcohol or ethanol is produced. And typically the fermentation process lasts about 2 weeks, but it can be a little bit longer. And white wines do in fact ferment at a cooler temperature than the red wines. So Riesling, this is a very sweet white wine variety. It pairs relatively well with spicy foods. I would say it's probably a good starter wine in the sense of it, because it being on the sweeter palate. So for someone who has a naive tongue for wine, this might be a good wine for them to start out with. Sauvignon Blanc is a very acidic wine. It has notes of kind of yellow fruits. It pairs well with seafood. So I tend to think of it as, we put acid or citrus fruits with our seafood. So Sauvignon goes quite well with seafood. Chardonnay is a pretty versatile white wine. It also has hints of yellow citrus fruit. It has oaky notes to it, and it pairs well again with like shellfish and seafood, as well as poultry. It is also the most widely planted white wine variety worldwide. And then Pinot Grigio or Pinot Gris, so Grigio obviously being the Italian word and Gris being French. So this is, interestingly enough, made from a purple reddish grape. But again, in the process of making white wines, you immediately remove that skin so it doesn't get any of that color from it. And so that is still a white wine, and it has notes of apple, pear, citrus, and it's a relatively light-bodied white wine. Then on to some of the red wines. So again, it's a very similar process of making the white wines, except that the skins are left in contact longer, allowing them to impart the red color. So then when talking about Merlot, this is a medium-bodied fruity wine that pairs well with many different fruits. It's commonly grown in the Washington region, which we'll get into at the very end. Pinot Noir is obviously quite popular down in the Oregon region. It's a versatile, light-bodied red wine. It has notes of kind of red fruits, so cranberries and cherry. It pairs well with kind of poultry and pork, as well as some cheeses. And then Cabernet Sauvignon. So this is actually a cross between a Cabernet Franc and a Sauvignon Blanc. And it pairs well with kind of darker meats, so lamb, beef, and then it is actually the most popular of all wines grown around the world. And then lastly, Syrah is a very full-bodied red wine that has a similar pairing profile to Cabernet Sauvignon. It pairs well with darker meats as well as actually spicier foods. So this is a chart that shows the breakdown of the top winemakers by country in the world. So not surprisingly, France and Italy and Spain are the top three, but the United States is the fourth. And then within the United States, actually 90% of all wine comes from California. But we will get into this at the very end. But Washington is actually the second largest grower in the United States. And the world's largest wine producer is actually based in Modesto, California, and that's at Gallo Vineyards. So in parts of Europe, so as I previously just discussed some of the wine grape varieties, and that's how some bottles are labeled. But in parts of Europe, there's actually these regional varieties that have to follow these strict rules that dictate what types of grapes go into that bottle to be labeled, a Bordeaux blend. So this is just an example of some of those regional varieties in France. So some common ones you've probably heard of, like Bordeaux and Burgundy. So in the Bordeaux region, for it to be a red Bordeaux, it would have to be a blend of Cabernet Sauvignon, Merlot, Cabernet Franc, Petit Verdot, and a Malbec. And then a white would be a Semillon and a Sauvignon Blanc. And likewise, then a Burgundy is actually just a 1-for-1 in terms of it being just one grape. But to be labeled a Burgundy, it needs to be of the Pinot Noir variety, and Chardonnay would be for the white variety. Then moving on to some of the specialty wines. So Champagne, we all know and love. So this is obviously a bubbly wine. And it is made by this process called secondary fermentation. And so essentially what that is they make a base wine in a very similar process to white wines, where the grapes are picked. They're actually picked a little bit earlier, though, than if you were making a standard white wine. And that imparts a little bit of a tartar flavor. And then after they've made that base wine, they re-add yeast and sugar in a closed environment, so that then when the fermentation process, or it goes through the secondary fermentation process, CO2 is released in this closed container, and that's what brings the bubbles. And actually, interestingly enough, there are two different types of champagne. There's Blanc de Blanc, which is a white wine variety, and then Blanc de Noir, which is a red wine variety. And there are three different grapes that can be used to make champagne. So in the Blanc de Blanc form, it's 100% Chardonnay. And then in the Blanc de Noir, it's either it's a combination of Pinot Noir and Pinot Meunier. And then by law, for it to be labeled a champagne, it does need to be from the Champagne region of France. Then port, this is a fortified sweet wine. If you know Len Altman at all, this is probably one of his favorite wines to drink. It is fortified means essentially that they add a spirit to it during the fermentation process. So that actually ends the fermentation process early. So in the case of port, they add brandy to it early during the fermentation process, and that ends it, leaving a sweeter wine. And there's two different forms of port. There's one that's called tawny, and that's considered to be an older port, and then ruby, which is younger. And similar to champagne, for it to truly be labeled a port wine, it needs to originate from Portugal, typically in the Douro River Valley. Sherry is very similar to port in the sense that it's just a fortified dry wine. So again, during the fermentation process, a spirit is added to it, again, typically brandy, and that leaves, in this case, a stronger dry wine. Rosé is frankly just very similar to white wine, except that there's just limited exposure to the grape skin. So that's what gives it that pinkish hue. And then lastly, ice wine. So these are especially wine that are grown primarily in colder climates, because essentially what happens is they leave the grapes on throughout all of winter, allowing them to freeze on the vines. And then when they crush the grapes, all of the water comes out. And so then you're left with a very sweet, concentrated flavor. Okay. So now moving a little bit more closely to a little closer to science and medicine, although not so much just right away. But we'll move into kind of the history of this enotherapy, or the concept of treating with wine. And so we'll go again back to kind of ancient times. So it was originally the Egyptians who first documented the concept of using wine as a human-made medicine, and this was back in 2200 BC. And the Egyptians actually have believed that wine could be used for remedies of child labor. In fact, they actually thought it could eradicate asthma, or quote unquote expel epilepsy, or be a remedy for dejection. The ancient Greeks and Romans actually used it as an antiseptic. So they did use it to kill bacteria in drinking water. I mean, I'm sure you can imagine what the conditions of drinking water were back then. And then they also used it as a digestive aid, and then to clean wounds and relieve pain. In fact, the ancient gladiators, it was used as an antiseptic. I'm sorry, this might be a little bit gross for this early in the morning, but to soak the internal organs in wine after battle before returning them to the body. So as an antiseptic. Hippocrates and many other Greek physicians supported the use of wine for many different indications, including for fever, as a diuretic, as a laxative, and then again as an antiseptic. And Plato actually wrote, quote, "While those in their 20s should drink wine in moderation, those in their 40s could drink as much as they wished to relieve the desiccation of old age." And then, as I mentioned earlier, the Roman soldiers were encouraged to drink wine to prevent dysentery, but also just to frankly improve strength. And so then after the fall of the Roman Empire, kind of moving into medieval times and post-medieval Europe, wine continued to be used medically, or at least for medicinal benefit. Many French physicians praised wine as a remedy for melancholy, and thought that it would have beneficial effects for, quote, the veins, the urinary tract, and then actually the liver, which I think is rather ironic because we, of course, know that alcohol can be rather toxic for the liver. They did also, interestingly enough, think that it would slow the rate of development of gray hair. I don't think there's any science in that, obviously. And then Italian physicians likewise thought it would be quite beneficial. And an Italian physician wrote that he recommended wine for the elderly to, quote, provide supplemental source of warmth to overcome the coldness that accompanies old age. Then moving a little more closely into modern times. So in the late 19th century, physicians actually started delineating which type of wine was intended for which illness. So a little more specifically, red wine was thought to be used for diarrhea, white wine could be used as a diuretic, port was used for fever, burgundy for anorexia, and champagne was used for nausea. And then actually even various pharmacopoeias, which are essentially these official publications that contain a list of medicinal drugs and their intended use, in fact, listed some wines in them throughout Europe. But even the first one that was published in the United States in 1820, in fact, listed 9 different wines. And so then obviously most of the things, aside from maybe from it being potentially an antiseptic because of the alcohol content in it, most of these prior ascribed uses had absolutely no basis in science. And so the medical community started to acknowledge that and stop using it for many of these different conditions. However, they did still recognize it as an important form of an antiseptic and frankly just a bacteria-free beverage, because even in the 19th century, the conditions of water may have not been that great. So they did at least acknowledge that it could be beneficial there. And then when Louis Pasteur first discovered that microorganisms are in fact the cause of disease, it further supported using it for the sterilization process of contaminated water. And in fact, it was used in this form as late as 1892 for a cholera outbreak that happened in Europe. And then, by the end of the 19th century, though, I think alcoholism began to be recognized as a real disease and that there are also just negative effects of alcohol. And so the medical community started shifting away from using alcohol or wine as a medical treatment. Okay, so then this is something that's been observed in modern times and has led to the investigation of alcohol and wine and its potential health benefits. It's this term called the French paradox, and essentially what that is that in modern times we've noticed that the French population tends to have a lower incidence of cardiovascular disease, despite the fact that they have a diet that's high in saturated fat. And so scientists and physicians and epidemiologists alike have all thought, well, maybe it's due to the fact that the French drink a lot of wine and frankly, often red wine. So that's what's led to kind of further investigation of all this. So moving into kind of the compounds of wine. So wine itself has over 500 compounds, ethanol, of course, being one of them. But we'll focus on the polyphenols, which are the ones that are thought to potentially have some health benefits. So they can be broken down into two different forms. So the flavonoids and the non-flavonoids. And the flavonoids are, they provide the taste and color to wine, but they also potentially do have some health benefits. And then the non-flavonoids are thought to be the ones that potentially have some health benefits as well. Resveratrol is one we'll discuss specifically in a little bit, and that's one that's gained some attention throughout the medical community. And this is the composition of wine in and of itself. Both white wine and red wine have all these compounds. However, red wine can have up to 10 times more polyphenols compared to white wine. So going into the flavonoids more specifically, so these are plant-based antioxidants. They are found in tea, fruits, vegetables, and wine. And it's been shown that they are able to lower LDL levels, inhibit platelet aggregation, and have anti-inflammatory effects. And they also are just antioxidants themselves. And it was shown that wine without ethanol was able to be anti-atherosclerotic. And so therefore it's felt that it is the polyphenols rather than the ethanol that is actually health protective, or at least health beneficial. Quercetin, so this is of a polyphenol of the flavonoid group, and it is a free radical scavenger. It's able to prevent LDL oxidation, and so essentially oxidize Oxidized LDL is able to promote atherosclerosis. So therefore, if you prevent oxidation of it, then you are anti-atherosclerotic. It's also able to relax vascular smooth muscle and inhibit platelet aggregation. So all of those mechanisms are cardioprotective. Then resveratrol. So this is of the non-flavonoid group. It's a non-flavonoid stilben. It's quite prominent in red wine and grapes, so much more so in the red wine variety, so anywhere from 3 to 10 times that compared to white wine. And plants produce it when they undergo stress, and it is thought to have potentially some protective effects, so much so that, as you can see on the right here, companies are now making it into natural supplements. So you don't, basically assuming, well, you don't need to drink wine, just take our supplement and you'll benefit your health.
Benchmark report for us that we could share that talks about, where they fall in terms of advisors, and it ranges from 10. I think it said the medium expense was around 56,000.
Correct.
So they kind of felt like,
their question, or is somebody just speaking? Okay. I don't know what that was. Anyways, so the exact amount of polyphenols depends on the grape variety, but Pinot Noir and Saint Laurent reds tend to have the highest concentration of polyphenols. So lastly, before we get into some of the studies, so this is the WHO's definition of a standard drink. The only reason that I bring this up is because when we get into these studies, some of them examine different drinking categories for the patient population. And so I think it's just important to kind of understand what potentially classifies a light drinker, a moderate drinker, a heavy drinker. And again, this is also just based on the form of alcohol that the people were consuming, because it depends on the strength of ethanol that's in the content. All right, so now moving into cardiovascular disease. So there's probably been hundreds of studies that have been done to examine wine and its effects on cardiovascular disease, or frankly, just alcohol and its effects on cardiovascular disease. So these are just some of the more recent and larger studies that have been done. So, again, this is just a snapshot of a couple of potential studies. So the first, starting from the top, the first one is a large Italian cohort, about 11,000 patients who had a recent MI, and they were followed for 3.5 years. And basically at baseline, their drinking habits were established. And this was actually a wine specific study. So these patients only drank wine, and they were divided into different drinking groups based on how much intake they had per day. And so essentially just non-drinkers, and then, 3 different other categories based on their drinking. And what they found was that for those who drank lower to moderate amounts of alcohol, so that was defined as less than or equal to 500 milliliters per day of wine, they had lower cardiovascular events compared to the non-drinkers, as well as to those in the higher consumption groups. They also did a subsequent long-term follow-up at 7.3 years later, and they found that, again, that same group of drinking habits, so less than 500 milliliters per day, they had overall decreased mortality from a fatal cardiovascular event. So that was defined as a fatal MI or a fatal stroke compared to the non-drinkers. Then in the next study, so this again was another Italian cohort of patients who only drank wine. This is about 7,000 patients who had stable chronic heart failure. And they were again divided into 4 different categories based on their drinking habits, one of which was a non-drinker group, or those who just frankly drank it so rarely that they didn't classify it as them being drinkers. And in this study, they not only assess clinical outcomes, but they also assess circulating biomarkers, as well as quality of life and depression. And firstly, they actually found there was an inverse correlation between all of the drinking categories, especially the higher ones, and depression. And also the higher drinking consuming groups had higher perceived quality of life. So these people were drunk and happy. And then what they did find, though, scientifically, was that for those who drank at least one glass of wine per day, there was evidence of decreased vascular inflammation by circulating biomarkers. They didn't, however, observe any statistical significance between any of the drinking groups and clinical events. So that was defined as developing an MI, having a heart failure exacerbation, the development of a new arrhythmia, or sudden death. And this was over a 4-year period. They did note, however, although it was not found to be statistically significant, that there was a decreasing trend for those who drank greater than or equal to 3 glasses of wine per day. Then in a very large Danish cohort of about 25,000 people, so they were categorized again based on their drinking habits. This was a study that it included all forms of alcohol intake, so wine, beer, and spirits, and they were again classified into their based on their drinking habits. And what they found was that for those who drank what they considered to be kind of moderate alcohol intake, so that was defined as 8 to 21 drinks per week, they had a lower risk of all-cause mortality. And then actually at all levels of alcohol intake, the wine drinkers specifically, because they did a further sub-analysis, they had a lower risk of all-cause mortality compared to non-wine drinkers. And then the wine drinkers also had a lower risk of death from cardiovascular disease compared to the non-wine drinkers, as well as the higher alcohol drinkers. Then moving on to another study. So in about 11 and a half or 11.5 K diabetic patients who, again, were grouped into different drinking categories based on how much they drank. This is also another study that included all forms of alcohol. They were followed for 5 years. And essentially what they found was that those who had moderate alcohol consumption, they had lower cardiovascular risk, they had lower microvascular complications, and lower all-cause mortality. And they did a further sub-analysis and found that for those who drank primarily wine, they benefited the most from this. So it was seen more so with those individuals. And they defined moderate drinking as for men less than or equal to 21 drinks per week, and for women less than or equal to 14 drinks per week. Then in a very large study done in only men, so 51,000 men, they assessed their alcohol habits, medical history, and cardiovascular risks prior to initiating a 10-year study. And then, for the prior 10 years, and then followed them for 2 years subsequently and assessed any newly diagnosed cardiovascular disease. And what they found was that there was an inverse association for risk of fatal MI and fatal cardiovascular death in all groups. And then they further separated the patients out based on whether they had had a prior or predisposing cardiovascular risk before the study even started, compared to those who were previously healthy, and they did not find any differences between the groups. And then lastly, in an all-female study of about 87,000, interestingly enough, female nurses only, relatively middle-aged, it was actually only ages 34 to 59, whereas these other studies had much larger age range. They again grouped them into different categories based on their drinking habits. And what they found was after 4 years, compared to non-drinkers at all levels of alcohol intake, the patients had lower risk of cardiovascular disease, both fatal and non-fatal, and a lower risk for ischemic stroke. And then there was an exceedingly small number of patients who went on to develop subarachnoid hemorrhage. So actually only 28 patients. So think of that, 28 patients out of 87,000 women. However, when they did statistical analysis, it was apparently found to be an increased risk. So then moving right along in a somewhat similar vein, but a slightly different assessment is blood pressure. So these are much smaller studies, but some recent ones that have been done. So in the first one, this was a study done in 24 completely healthy premenopausal women. So these were women who did not smoke, did not have hypertension, did not have any high blood pressure, any cardiovascular disease or high cholesterol. They were not diabetics and they didn't take any medications. And they did, however, have regular alcohol intake for at least the prior year. And this was a rather complex design study, but essentially in the end, what it showed was that modest wine intake actually increased systolic and diastolic blood pressure. Although I will note, it was statistically significant, but it was an incredibly minor increase in blood pressure. So it was basically found to be an increase of 2 millimeters of mercury. So very small, but in their analysis, it was found to be statistically significant. And then they also assessed heart rate, and that was unaffected by wine. The same group of researchers did a similar study of 24 type 2 well-controlled type 2 diabetics, again in a very complex similar design study where patients were either randomized to drink red wine or de-alcoholized red wine at the same volume. And what they found was that the de-alcoholized red wine, during the sleep period, the diastolic blood pressure was lower, but the awake systolic and diastolic blood pressure were increased, and that the heart rate was increased basically during sleep and wake. They also, because this was diabetic patients, they evaluated if red wine had any impact on glycemic control, and they did not identify any effect there. Then in another study done in type 2 diabetics, this was done in 54 type 2 diabetics. These were primarily men, but there were a few women included in the study. And this was actually a study done in people who previously completely abstained from alcohol. And they were randomized to either consume 150 milliliters of white wine, red wine, or water with dinner. And it was supposed to be a strict Mediterranean diet. And they were followed for 6 months. And what they found was that there was no observed difference in the ambulatory 24-hour blood pressure, although there was this very transient drop in blood pressure about 3 to 4 hours after wine consumption when compared to the water drinkers, but this was not sustained. And then the same researchers did the exact same study, but in a slightly larger group and a slightly longer study. So in 224 well-controlled type 2 diabetics who were previously alcohol abstainers, they were followed for 2 years. In this case, they were divided to receive either 150 milliliters of white wine, red wine, or water, again with a Mediterranean diet dinner. And in this study, they did not observe any differences in blood pressure. They did, however, also evaluate cholesterol level in this study, and they found that red wine was able to increase HDL. And then lastly, in a study of 60 untreated hypertensive patients, this was a double-blind placebo-controlled crossover study where the patients were either receiving a grape extract that contained both grape and red wine, or a grape extract that was just grape alone. And it was only a 4-week trial. And just for your knowledge, the grape extract alone would be lower in flavonoid compared to the combination extract. And what they found was that the ambulatory 24-hour systolic diastolic blood pressure were significantly lower in the combination grape wine extract group compared to the control. And so then before we move on to kind of cancer, in a similar vein, or at least still relevant to the heart, atrial fibrillation. So the data surrounding some of the other cardiovascular diseases may be a little bit uncertain, but in regards to atrial fibrillation, it's been found that pretty convincing evidence that alcohol and wine certainly provoke the development of atrial fibrillation. So these are just 2 studies that have been done, but in a large UK study, they found that moderate to high consumption of alcohol was an independent risk factor for the development of or for the progression of paroxysmal atrial fibrillation into persistent atrial fibrillation. And then in a much smaller study, they took patients who had had a prior episode of idiopathic atrial fibrillation, And they identified that regular alcohol consumption was more likely to cause these patients to develop a recurrence of that arrhythmia. And then one last thing before I transition into cancer is I'd like to just bring up these two large studies that were done in Europe that basically assessed the cardiac disease in patients who have a variant in the alcohol dehydrogenase gene. And so alcohol dehydrogenase is the enzyme that breaks down, or at least one of the enzymes that breaks down alcohol. And so essentially these patients are unable to degrade alcohol properly. And what they found was in these patients, they had lower cardiac disease. And frankly at all levels of alcohol that they drank. So they didn't modify or tell the patients to drink any certain amount. They just let them drink what they normally drink, and they assessed the incidence of cardiac disease. And interestingly enough, so they found these patients had lower cardiac disease, and so the authors concluded, well, therefore, less alcohol means less cardiac disease. And I think the reason the authors chose to conclude this was because these individuals tend to drink less alcohol in general because they're unable to degrade alcohol properly. They develop rather uncomfortable side effects such as becoming flushed or having a headache. But I would argue that you would need to disagree with this statement because they themselves said that at much higher or at any level of alcohol intake, these patients still had lower cardiovascular disease. So I would argue that potentially it needs to be further examined whether these variants actually are cardioprotective themselves rather than the fact that these patients just selectively drink less alcohol because it causes them to feel uncomfortable. Okay, so now lastly, moving into cancer. So as you'll see, there are very mixed results based on the form of cancer that you're choosing to examine. Cancer obviously is a broad specialty, if you will, or a broad disease. And so it tends to be mixed results based on what type of cancer you're examining. But overall, when it comes to breast cancer, there seems to be rather definitive, more compelling evidence that unfortunately, even with light drinking, there is a slight increased risk of developing breast cancer. And so, in the case of breast cancer, with light drinking, there's a 4% increased risk. And with heavy drinking, it can be as high as 40 to 50% increased risk. And so it's known that increased estrogen can be a risk factor for the development of breast cancer. And so the proposed carcinogenic aspect of alcohol is that acetaldehyde, which is a product of ethanol's oxidation, is in and of itself carcinogenic, but also that alcohol is able to increase aromatase activity. And so you may remember that aromatase is an enzyme that actually converts testosterone into estrogen. And then further, alcohol is also able to inhibit two important enzymes for estrogen degradation. So therefore making it so that estrogen levels would potentially be higher. So then again, here are just a few more studies looking at alcohol or wine and its association with different cancers. Again, numerous studies have been done. These are just some of the more recent and larger ones. So in the first one, this was a study done in Canada evaluating ovarian cancer. So this was a case control study where they took women who had histologically confirmed ovarian cancer and age-matched controls, and they assessed their drinking habits by questionnaire. And this was an all-inclusive study, so it did not distinguish just between it didn't just have wine drinkers. And what they found was that there was a lower risk of ovarian cancer for those who drank primarily wine, actually, so especially red wine compared to non-drinkers, and that this difference was not observed for those who primarily drank beer or spirits. So they concluded that basically wine was potentially protective. And they actually found that for those who drank all forms of alcohol, as long as, or at least different forms of alcohol, as long as wine was included in that combination, there was some risk reduction. Then in a large Italian study done evaluating urothelial bladder cancer, this was done across 10 different countries. And again, the patients were divided based on how much alcohol they drank. And what they found was based on the initial baseline questionnaires, and then when they followed them over a period of time, the average lifetime consumption of alcohol, as well as the baseline consumption of alcohol, did not seem to be associated at all with developing urothelial bladder cancer. So it did not seem to have any effect. And then in a very similar study by a different researcher, but using actually the same cancer registry, or at least patient registry across the same countries, they had patients who were followed for 8 years, and they were evaluating the development of endometrial cancer in women. And these women were followed for 8 years. And again, they evaluated drinking habits at baseline and then at the end of completion of the study. And what they found was that there was no association between their alcohol intake and the development of endometrial cancer based on their baseline or lifetime alcohol intake. And then in a large study done in France, a French cohort of women who were followed for a total of 15 years evaluating breast cancer. So interestingly enough, in this study, they found that there was no association between high alcohol consumption, whatever form that may be, so beer, wine, spirits, and the development of breast cancer during the premenopausal period. However, in the postmenopausal period, there seemed to be a linear association between total alcohol intake and breast cancer risk. So they found that basically greater than 2 glasses of wine per day increased the risk of breast cancer by 33%. And then lastly, a large prospective study done in the Netherlands evaluating head and neck cancers. Here they assessed their drinking habits, as well as smoking habits and dietary habits, and they followed them for 17.3 years. And what they found was that for those who consumed greater than 30 grams of alcohol per day, and just for your knowledge, that 30 grams basically equates to about 2 glasses of wine. That was associated with an increased risk of head and neck cancer. They did, however, do a further sub-analysis, and they found that when looking just at wine, there actually appeared to potentially be an inverse relationship, although this was not found to be statistically significant. And then I'll quickly just move back into breast cancer, because this is one where there tends to be a little more definitive evidence. So there's been lots of studies done to evaluate the risk of wine or alcohol and its association with breast cancer. And as I said, it tends to be more compelling and definitive that there is unfortunately an increased risk, and that risk is rather dose dependent. So this chart here is actually showing that. This is a chart from a meta-analysis of about 50 studies, and it shows that the risk moves in this almost linear pattern as you increase your alcohol intake. And so the relative risk of developing breast cancer is about 1.5 when you get to be as high as 40 grams of alcohol per day. And then a subsequent meta-analysis of about 100 studies found that the risk will actually increase 10 to 13% for every additional 10 grams of alcohol you consume per day. And on the next few slides, I'm going to show some rather complex charts, but essentially what it all boils down to is this comes from a meta-analysis of over 100 studies that were evaluating either case control or cohort studies that were done in light drinkers compared to non-drinkers, evaluating the risk of developing breast cancer. And essentially what they found was that even modest drinking had a significant increased risk of developing breast cancer for the light drinkers, and that was actually defined as less than or equal to 1 drink per day. So essentially the relative risk was 1.04. So that light drinking, it's a modest increase, but it was found to be statistically significant. So I'll move into those charts, but essentially this is the one that's evaluating the cohorts. So don't get too lost in this, but essentially I know it seems like everything's moving back and forth, but when they did their statistical analysis, it tends to see that things hover a little bit more so on this side of things in terms of being an increased risk of developing breast cancer. And then I'll move on to this one just because it shows at the very bottom. Hopefully you can read that. I know it's a little bit hard to read, but this is the one evaluating the case controls. And so at the bottom, they show kind of the actual relative risk. So for both case control and for cohort studies that were done, the relative risk was found to be 1.05. So again, a modest but statistically significant increased risk of developing breast cancer based on alcohol consumption. And then I'll just end with kind of coming back home here to Washington State. Just I thought it'd be nice to end there. So just evaluating wine in Washington. So as I had said earlier, California is the #1 producer in the United States, but Washington State is #2. We have about 50,000 acres of vineyard land in Washington State. The Columbia Valley agricultural viticultural area was first established in 1984, so it's actually relatively young. And we actually get more annual sun than the Napa Valley region over in the Columbia Valley area. So we get 290 days versus the 260 that they get in Napa. They also have more acreage over in Columbia Valley compared to Napa. So it's the 50,000 compared to about 45,000. And some of the common varieties that are grown over in the Columbia Valley region are Cabernet Sauvignon, Merlot, Chardonnay, and Riesling. Although Syrah is also starting to become relatively popular in Washington State. And then lastly, just to include Oregon. So again, we grow far more than Oregon, but they have by far a predominant grape that they tend to grow, which of course is Pinot Noir. And they also have the largest continuous organic vineyard there. It's called King Estate. It's actually quite beautiful. It's in the Willamette Valley. I went there with my mom several years ago. One last thing about Oregon wines is they're actually very strict with their Pinot Noir. They are at least stricter than other parts of the United States. They require that at least 90% of the grape that be that of the Pinot Noir variety for the bottle to be labeled that. So then just some concluding remarks. So I think, unfortunately, the health effects of wine remain relatively uncertain, but at best, red wine in moderation has potentially some cardioprotective effects. And then if there is a health benefit at all, that it's not because of the ethanol or the alcohol that is in the drink, but rather the polyphenols. And that there is strong evidence that wine, or frankly just ethanol in general, does have an increased risk for the development of breast cancer and potentially others. Here are my references, and the word of the day is Dionysus. Hopefully you all know what that is. If not, I'm happy to share. And I will open it up for questions.
Do we have any questions out there? I got a comment here. Did you say Pinot Noir has the highest quercetin content?
It has the highest polyphenol content, or it's one of the reds that has the higher polyphenol content. So Pinot Noir and Saint Laurent reds are the two red wine varieties that have some of the highest polyphenol content. I mean, it varies, of course, by every single grape, but yes, that's what I said.
This is Vinod here. Can you hear me, Kathy?
Yep, I can.
Oh, thank you. That was a good overview. If I want to know anything about wine, that was a good summary. I didn't know a lot, so I learned quite a bit from that. So, and of course, stepping up to the big plate, trying to get up to the pedigree. I think that was an awesome job you did over there. A couple questions.
Sure.
So, is there, when you've looked at, maybe three questions. One is, when we look at beneficial effects, and in your research that you've done, most do these studies that look at beneficial effects, do they also balance out for the risks, in a sense of other social, economic parameters and everything, in terms of they were happy, but the people around them suffered a little bit more because of the alcoholism aspect, or the risk part is one. The second is, now that you say the ethanol content is not necessarily as important as the polyphenol. So, rather than drink wine, do you just go to Costco and pick up those supplements that you get and just have that, even though, you can forego the pleasure of drinking the wine? And lastly, coming to the COVID-19 pandemic, did you find anything in terms of research in terms of alcoholism and COVID-19 risks?
Those are all great questions. So I'll take the first one first. So as far as evaluating other risks, I didn't necessarily see anything that looked into like socioeconomic risk, but they did, take into account dietary habits and smoking risk and potentially predisposing cardiovascular risk or things like that. So they did definitely perform that in their analysis, but I did not come across anything as far as like socioeconomic risk. And then hold on, I'm trying to remember what your second question was. I know the answer to your third question though is no, I did not come across anything related to alcoholism and COVID-19, and I apologize. What was the second question?
Oh, just taking a supplement of polyphenol instead of drinking wine.
Honestly, I think you're right. I mean, I think really the benefits from what I can understand is it really is likely due to these polyphenols that are in the grapes themselves. So you're absolutely right. I think potentially you could, quote unquote, save yourself or actually, make your life sadder because you can't have the lovely wine and just take the extracts themselves and potentially have the cardioprotective effect. I do think that there needs to be more studies though of examining actually just those grape extract or the grape wine extracts themselves and cardiovascular disease. I did not come across too many of those. So I think there would need to be more studies of that nature done to further examine whether it actually is possible to gain the benefit from not drinking the wine itself.
Thank you, Kathy.
Yeah.
We have other questions?
Do you know what Dionysus is?
The god of wine?
Yep.
God of reincarnation, the wine.
Goddess of wine.
Greek or Roman?
That's the Greek.
Greek.
That's the
Should be
Greek.
Greek.
It's Bacchus if it's Roman.
What was the quote about 20-year-olds drinking a certain amount and 40-year-olds?
That was Plato. He basically said that 20-year-olds should only drink wine in moderation. I mean, to summarize it, it was basically like 20-year-olds should only drink wine in moderation, whereas if you're in your 40s, which apparently was old back then, you could drink as much wine as you want to basically cure the horribleness of being old.
Yeah, that's what I wanted Dr. Minotti to comment on. Are you there, Nick?
I am here.
Yeah. What do you think about that?
I only drink Prosecco.
Sorry, I did not talk about Prosecco.
Yeah, Prosecco has become popular. Is it essentially made the same way as
champagne? Yeah, it's just Italian.
Champagne region.
Yeah. Prosecco is fine.
Drew, are you there?
Yeah, I am.
Yeah, so I guess you have to take the message home to your dad, who's a pretty wine connoisseur, that the health effects are pretty marginal, it seems.
That won't deter him.
Though, his wine probably cures everything, right, Drew?
Yes. Hangover in a bottle.
Right. You have enough glasses, he won't care.
No.
Now, Frank, you know a heck of a lot about wine. What's your...
Oh.
It seems to me that it's actually fairly disappointing that the evidence of the health effects of wine really turns out to be pretty weak.
Right. Yeah, I mean, as Kathy alluded to, there's a lot of moving parts in some of these studies, and I think as Vino had asked about, you sometimes question some of the tangential factors, but beyond the kind of startling breast cancer issue, and obviously in moderation, there also don't seem to be any huge negatives either.
So the pleasurable effects of modest drinking are worth it, is what it comes down to.
Yeah, I mean, I only presented the one study where they evaluated quality of life and depression, but those people were much happier, despite the fact that they had heart failure.
Yeah.
Which could be there's a lot of depression associated with heart failure.
Yeah. And I was just, the other day I was looking at, because I'm part of the Quad AI COVID-19 task force, and there was in January an article in JAMA Open Access, which I suppose some people would question, but it did estimate they looked at a pretty large group of people, a 14% increase in alcohol consumption during the pandemic. And that was over about 11 months by the time it was published. But interestingly enough, women in particular had a 41% increase. And of course, part of that's artificial because their average increase was less to begin with. So, but it was kind of an interesting, obviously you can point to several, reasons why that would be. But, combination of unemployment, having to work on the front lines, working from home, having to manage schooling for their kids at home on 6 different computers, or or a loss of a loved one, et cetera. So all sorts of reasons for it, of course.
Yeah.
Good
All right,
job,
so-
Kathy. Is there much wine production in Hawaii?
I do think they make like weird pineapple wine, but not on Kauai. I think it's on Maui.
Yeah, there's a couple of good wineries on Maui, actually. Kind
Oh,
of.
do they actually make it from grape, or
upcountry.
do they not make just pineapple wine?
That's right.
They make it from grapes. Frank, I've tasted that. I'm not sure I'd say it was good winery.
Yeah, I don't think it's good.
No,
Big rain on Maui on the upper slopes of the mountains.
yes, correct. Yeah, kind of upcountry. Yeah,
Upcountry.
I don't think it's winning any awards anytime.
All right. Well, thank you. It's 8 o'clock. I know the fellows have to move on to a board review session. So thank you for that presentation. And we'll end it there.
All right, thank you.
Thanks.